Hey folks, so this is the second video in this section that deals with some theorems that we're going to be running into. So go ahead and go down to the list of theorems. So the first one that we have is called the angle-side-angle congruency theorem. So what we've got here is if you have two angles and the included side of one triangle, and you know that those are congruent to two angles and the included side of another triangle. So let's stop right there. So let's go to our picture here and let's mark a pair of angles congruent. And then it says two angles, so let's mark another pair of angles congruent. So now I have two angles congruent to two angles. And it also says that I have the included side. Remember that included side from the last section means that it's the side between those two angles. So the included sides are congruent to each other. If that occurs, then you automatically know the two triangles are congruent to each other. And then the next theorem says that we have the angle side. So it's the same three words, but they're rearranged. That's important. So we've got if two angles and a, this time, non-included side of a triangle are going to be congruent to two angles and a non-included side of another triangle, then you know that the two triangles are congruent to each other. So again, I have two angles, so there's one pair of angles, and here's a second pair of angles. So there's two angles congruent to two angles, and a non-included side. So pick one of the other sides that's not included, so maybe this pair of sides. So if you know that two angles and a non-included side are congruent to two angles and a non-included side, then you know that those two triangles are congruent to each other. Theorem 12.9 is a little different, not dealing with triangles at all. It's dealing with a parallelogram. It says that the opposite sides and the opposite angles of a parallelogram are always going to be congruent to each other. So if we were to mark our parallelogram here, we would say that this pair of opposite sides, these are congruent. This pair of opposite sides are congruent. This pair of angles are congruent, and this pair of angles are congruent. So that's what we can say about any parallelogram. Now, what I would like for you to do before we go back to class is I would like for you to list all of the ways so far that you have been given to prove that two triangles are congruent to each other. We dealt with some in section 12.1, and we also just now dealt with some in section 12.2. So make a list of all of the ways that you can prove two triangles are congruent to each other.